He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue. That's the Chicago way.
There's basically three movies that formed my opinion of Chicago before I moved here, and that's, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, obviously, Michael Mann's Thief, and then Brian De Palma's The Untouchables.
Right now we're on the DuSable Bridge.
This is where Eliot Ness and Malone meet for the first time. So Kevin Costner's sort of hanging over the edge. He's despondent because he's just had that first busted raid, and Sean Connery's Malone wanders by and sees him throwing some trash in the water, and that's where they have their first sort of tete-a-tete here.
When you first saw that scene, before coming to Chicago, where did you imagine this bridge was in reality?
I mean, it seems subterranean, right? And as a kid who grew up in the suburbs, that was such a quintessential city look that this bridge had. Like, I'd never seen these sort of bascule bridges before. And so that, to me, had this very authentically early 20th century urban development feel to it.
We're actually below Michigan Avenue right now. We've got traffic passing above us. We've got these great sub-level streets, but we're also a city of great architecture, right? What are we looking out at right here is the South Loop, which is where so much of the film is shot.
So, Ignatiy, we're standing outside Union Station, home of probably the most famous scene from The Untouchables, the staircase sequence.
The big suspense set piece of the film.
The big Battleship Potemkin-based sequence, where Andy Garcia swoops in and saves the baby carriage and all that.
It's probably the least interesting location to talk about because it's the only one of the major locations in the film that actually plays itself. The interior of Union Station plays itself, the exterior of Union Station plays itself. Otherwise, every building that you see in the film is standing in for something else. Though it is shot in Chicago, where obviously this really took place, it's not shot in the places where it took place. It's usually shot in places that look more ornate, more beautiful, more impressive than the real locations. But Union Station is a Union Station.
We're in front of Roosevelt University, which in the film is a stand-in for the Lexington Hotel, or at least the lobby of it is.
The real Lexington Hotel is about 17 blocks south of here. I think it's something the film does very often, is it takes the most impressive facade it can present for these locations to make this conflict at the center of the movie between these gangsters and the law seem as big and outsized as possible. And though it was quite big, it really happened in fairly unremarkable locations.
The Lexington Hotel was kind of a rundown dump. Capone just had a little corner of it. The rest of the building was a hotel, but it was like cheap hotel rooms for traveling salesmen.
This is a doorknob from the Lexington Hotel, but specifically
from the floor where Capone had his offices. And so this was actually removed at the early stages of the abandonment of the building.
It's interesting to see these actual sort of dingy artifacts of these real men, and you kind of realize, what a sort of huge mythical figure they created around Eliot Ness. We're in front of the Rookery, which in the movie is the stand-in for Eliot Ness's office.
It's a very opulent building that no law enforcement organization could ever afford to put its headquarters in.
I think you can see why they picked it, though. I've got the Chicago Board of Trade behind us, which is the famous image from the poster. It's where they do their sort of hero's walk from here directly across the street to the post office where they do the first raid. But, beyond that, I mean, the Rookery, it looks like if you were to draw a comic book about like a hero detective, like you would use an archway like this. Like it looks like a center of power. I mean, you can see why they would use this as sort of a mythical city block. And this has also been used very famously in The Dark Knight. I mean, this is where Batman and the Joker had their big showdown right out here in front of the Chicago Board of Trade as well.
And if you talk about how this conflict is depicted, this conflict of money, right? How do you make it seem as big as possible, seem as looming? Yeah, you throw the Board of Trade in the background.
I mean, this is where literally all the concentrated wealth of Chicago is, right here in front of us. And they're literally defending it from right outside. It's like the ramparts right outside where all the money is coming from.
This is 600 South Dearborn. It's the real location of Eliot Ness's office. an austere building tucked away close to Printer's Row. Not very inspiring. It looks like a big brick file cabinet.
But I think it kind of really tells you a lot about Eliot Ness himself. I mean, you know, what I read about him, he actually wasn't really a gun-toting sort of crusader cop. He was a guy who didn't like to leave his office very much.
The real Eliot Ness really wasn't that impressive a guy. In fact, he gets his job through his brother-in-law. You rarely see his name in the newspapers of doing anything. He was kind of an underling. He was actually a relatively young man, as was Capone at the time these things were going on. In later life, he started writing his autobiography. And he had a co-writer who looked at the manuscript and thought, this isn't very interesting, but this isn't going to sell. So he wrote this really sensational version of it. According to one story, Ness takes a look at this and says, well, that's not true. Then, in the midst of all this, Eliot Ness drops dead. And now it's in the hands of the co-author. The book comes out, becomes this amazing bestseller, and so he becomes a person who is part of fiction that is also a very real person.
You know, kids who didn't grow up in Chicago, like myself, if you asked me who the hero and villain of Chicago was, it would be Eliot Ness and Al Capone. These very real men who sort of, you know, engaged in bureaucracy on one side and actual sort of low-level gritty crime on the other become these larger-than-life mythic figures. I mean, do you think that that's deserved?
Well, it's interesting to see the transformation of people who are, you know, pretty modest circumstances and in real life not all that glamorous. But people like to live vicariously the sense of adventure, and they can read themselves and their own dreams of a glamorous, exciting life. And so I think even in the earlier days, people thought about this as a more glamorized, idealized vision. And people love to hitch onto things, particularly when they see it on the screen or they read about it in an exciting book. This is where the big fight scene happens with Kevin Costner and Billy Drago, which ends with him basically getting pushed off the roof right here. You can recognize the buildings. Drago's going down the building and then lands on Garland Court down below, and then the famous line, "Where's Nitty? He's in the car." But you do have a good location here because the area where the body falls, it's like an alley, and it has an almost tight, almost film noir kind of character to it. Even across the way, we have fire escapes and back alleys, which is something that's not on the usual tourist destinations. And these are real kind of dreamy, evocative places that almost seem like places where people normally aren't. And so it gives kind of this kind of old style sense of people's conception of Chicago. It's kind of a place of back alleys, mystery, and maybe even some danger.
Well, I think that's it, right? We've covered everything that we could possibly cover in this Untouchables tour, right?
At least as far as the South Loop locations are concerned.
Right. Well, you want to go have a drink?
I don't drink.
Okay. For crimes against pop culture, we're gonna lock you up here.
Oh, these things are not comfortable. Okay, let's hope these work.
Where's that key?